Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where ancient peaks pierce the sky and morning mist clings to forgotten valleys, lies a story so disturbing it still haunts these weathered ridges today. This isn't merely a tale of mountain isolation, it's a chilling account of how complete separation from civilization can corrupt the very essence of human nature. The year was 1923. In the remote wilderness of McDowell County, West Virginia, families lived cut off from the world for months at a time, prisoners of geography and weather. Among them, the Hollister family occupied a modest log cabin at the absolute end of a mountain road, a road that winter transformed into an impassable barrier, sealing them away from humanity for 4, sometimes 5 brutal months each year. Jeremiah Hollister ruled this isolated domain with the authority of a mountain king. Towering and gaunt, his thick black beard concealed a weathered face dominated by piercing blue eyes that seemed to penetrate straight through to one's soul. At 42, tragedy had already carved deep wounds into his life. His wife Sarah had died in childbirth, taking with her their unborn son and leaving Jeremiah to raise 6-year-old Martha in complete solitude. From that devastating winter forward, father and daughter became each other's entire universe. The nearest neighbors lived 6 treacherous miles away through unforgiving terrain. Visits were rare, usually confined to brief summer months when travel was remotely possible. Even then, the Hollisters rarely welcomed outsiders to their mountain sanctuary. Pastor Williams made annual pilgrimages to every isolated family in his sprawling mountain parish. His visits to the Hollister cabin became increasingly troubling duties. Year after year, he watched Martha transform from a bright-eyed child into a withdrawn teenager who couldn't meet anyone's gaze directly, her arms perpetually wrapped protectively around herself. Jeremiah was always strange, recalls 93-year-old Eleanora Davis, one of the last surviving residents who knew the family. Her weathered hands tremble with memory. Even before Sarah's death, he rarely came to town. When he did, people noticed something unsettling, the way he watched everyone, suspicious of their every motive. Sarah had been their lifeline to civilization, making urgent supply runs down the mountain with the haunted look of someone constantly glancing over her shoulder. After her death, those connections withered away. When father and daughter occasionally appeared together at the village store, uncomfortable silence followed in their wake. Martha moved like a ghost behind Jeremiah, never straying beyond arm's reach. Attempts at friendly conversation met with whispered single-word responses, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind. But it was the winter of 1937 that would shatter this disturbing equilibrium forever. The storms that year were legendary, even by brutal mountain standards. Snow piled higher than living memory, and howling winds tore through the valleys with supernatural fury. During these long, dark months of absolute isolation, something happened in that remote cabin that would horrify even the most hardened mountain folk. Martha, now 20 and conspicuously unmarried, unusual for mountain girls of that era, became pregnant with her first child. When spring finally conquered winter's stranglehold, Martha was mysteriously absent from town. Jeremiah made his supply runs alone, purchasing items that raised eyebrows throughout the community: baby clothes, infant blankets, medical supplies. "My daughter is expecting," was his stone-faced explanation to anyone bold enough to ask. But suspicion spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community. Martha hadn't been seen with any local young men. No suitors had made the treacherous climb to court her. The mountain grapevine carried increasingly dark whispers about the true nature of life in that isolated cabin. The horrifying truth would finally emerge on a rain-soaked June night in 1938, when Dr. William Foster received an urgent summons to climb the dangerous path to the Hollister homestead. What he discovered there would haunt him until his dying day, a family secret so disturbing it would become mountain legend, echoing through these ancient valleys for generations to come. But that revelation, and the shocking truth about Martha's pregnancy, was only the beginning of a nightmare that stretched across generations, leaving scars no community gossip or passage of time could ever heal. It began with a child. A 6-year-old girl walked into a one-room schoolhouse with bruises on her face. When her teacher asked what had happened, she delivered a sentence so devastating that it tore open the dark secret hidden in an isolated mountain cabin. But before that moment of truth, you need to understand the pattern. A tragic cycle of children born into shadows, each carrying the unbearable weight of a family's silence. In the rugged Appalachian Mountains, people understood boundaries. Even in places where privacy was sacred, there were lines families knew not to cross. But the relationship between Jeremiah and Martha Hollister ignored those lines, pushing into a realm so forbidden it shocked even neighbors who had learned to look away. The tragedy began in 1938, when Martha's first child, a baby girl, lived only 3 days. After the burial, silence settled over the Hollister cabin like an endless fog. For nearly a year, Martha disappeared from sight. Only Jeremiah ventured into town for supplies, his presence stiff and guarded, avoiding every unnecessary glance or word. But silence never stopped life from forcing its way forward. By the spring of 1939, whispers returned. Martha was pregnant again. When her labor came, Jeremiah called on Ida Mae Jenkins, a discreet midwife whose hands had steadied many dangerous births. What she encountered in that cabin would haunt her until her last days. That house had a strange smell, Ida Mae later confessed, barely above a whisper. Like something wounded. Despair hung in the walls. The child, a boy named Elijah, was born bearing unmistakable signs of something unnatural. His fused fingers resembled claws. His mismatched eyes, one Jeremiah's piercing blue, one Martha's warm brown, announced the truth of his parentage without a word. Worst of all was the swelling of his head, the telltale sign of hydrocephalus. "That boy won't last the winter," Ida Mae warned bluntly. Jeremiah only nodded, as if he'd known it all along. But Elijah defied her. He survived not only that first winter but 5 more, though he never walked or spoke properly. Martha carried him everywhere, her love fierce against the crushing weight of inevitability. The pattern continued. Martha conceived again, giving birth to a daughter, Ruth, whose mind lagged behind though her body appeared whole. Another child, a boy, was stillborn in 1944, his tiny grave hidden behind the cabin in a family cemetery already heavy with loss. That family always had troubles, recalls Harlan Thompson, a local historian. Stillbirths, children dying young. The Hollisters had married cousins for generations. By the 1940s, the founder effect had caught up with them. Their bloodline was unraveling from the inside. In 1945, pneumonia finally claimed Elijah. At his small burial, neighbors whispered as Martha clutched Ruth's hand, her belly round with another child. In June 1946, Sarah was born. And for the first time, something felt different. Unlike her siblings, Sarah was healthy. Her sharp blue eyes mirrored Jeremiah's, and she grew quickly, bright and alert. Jeremiah doted on her, parading her through town in a way that unsettled everyone who noticed. He showed her off like she was his prize, recalls Clementine Parker, who worked at the grocery store. The resemblance between them, it was undeniable. Same eyes, same jaw. It was disturbing. As Sarah grew, she escaped the worst of the family's genetic curse. By 5, she was attending the local schoolhouse, where her teacher, Miss Abigail Wilson, saw promise. Sarah was far ahead of Ruth, though still behind her peers. And through her innocent words, the world would finally glimpse the horror of life in the Hollister home. One rainy autumn morning in 1952, Sarah arrived at school with a bruise staining one side of her face. When Miss Wilson gently asked what had happened, the little girl's answer froze the room. "Daddy got angry because Mommy didn't want to sleep in his bed anymore," Sarah said simply. "He says Mommy is his, that she always has been since Grandma died." Miss Wilson immediately went to Sheriff John Buchanan. But the sheriff only shook his head. "Those mountain families have their own ways," he said. "We don't interfere unless there's clear danger." But Sarah's words had opened a door that could never be closed again. And what would happen next would prove that sometimes, the most immediate danger comes from the very people who are supposed to protect innocent children. When a lost hunter stumbled upon a fresh grave behind the Hollister cabin, he uncovered something that would change everything. Yet the real shock wasn't the crude headstone marking Jeremiah Hollister's resting place, it was what Martha would later whisper to a kind stranger under the mountain stars that revealed the full horror of what had happened in that isolated cabin. And it raised a chilling question: did Jeremiah truly die of pneumonia, or was there something far more sinister behind his sudden disappearance? The winter of 1952 to 1953 wrapped itself around the Hollister cabin like an iron shroud, cutting the family off from the outside world for months. By the time the snow melted and spring light returned to the Appalachian valleys, something fundamental had shifted on that lonely mountainside. Martha appeared in town that spring with Ruth and Sarah by her side, but longtime residents immediately sensed a dramatic change. At just 36, she looked weathered, aged as though she had lived another decade over that brutal winter. And what startled the community even more was the absence of Jeremiah, the domineering patriarch who had ruled the Hollister family with a suffocating grip for years. Weeks passed, and still no one saw him. Then, in July 1953, fate delivered the first clue. Joseph Miller, a seasoned hunter, lost his bearings while tracking a deer deep in the mountains. As dusk settled over the peaks, he stumbled into the Hollister clearing. Behind the cabin, in the small family cemetery where so many of Martha's children lay buried, Miller spotted a fresh grave. A wooden marker bore the words, Jeremiah Hollister, January 12, 1953. "I thought it strange no one in town knew he'd died," Miller later told Sheriff Buchanan. "But what unsettled me most was what I saw through the window." Inside, lit by lamplight, Martha sat at the table with her daughters. To Miller's surprise, she looked calm, almost peaceful, like someone relieved of a crushing burden. And indeed, the summer that followed brought remarkable changes. With Jeremiah gone, Martha came into town more often. She moved without the nervous, hurried air people remembered. She tended a small garden, let Sarah attend school regularly, and even Ruth seemed less burdened in her grandfather's absence. It was during this period that Martha met Jacob Wheeler, a carpenter who had recently settled in the area. A widower grieving the loss of his wife to tuberculosis, Jacob sought quiet in the mountains. Unlike the locals, he ignored the rumors surrounding the Hollisters. "Everyone carries a past," Jacob would shrug. "What matters is the life you choose from here." Their friendship grew slowly, casual meetings at the store, brief talks after church. But for a woman who had spent her entire adult life under relentless control, Jacob's simple kindness felt extraordinary. By October 1953, Jacob asked if he could formally court her. The town's reaction was swift: shock, disapproval, and morbid fascination. How could a respectable man tie himself to Martha Hollister, whose past carried such shadows? And in mountain communities, secrets never stay buried for long. One Sunday, after church, Clementine Parker cornered Jacob. Her lined face was grim, her words sharp. "You know who those girls' father really is, don't you?" she demanded. Jacob, uneasy, replied that he assumed Martha's husband had died young. Clementine gave a bitter laugh. "Martha was never married. Those girls, their father was the same man who raised her. Jeremiah Hollister took his own daughter as his. You're mixing yourself into a cursed family." The revelation struck Jacob like a blow. He drove for hours along winding roads, mind racing, until darkness fell. At last, his headlights cut across the familiar clearing of the Hollister cabin. He needed answers. Martha was waiting on the porch, calm as the night itself. "You found out, didn't you?" she asked softly. Jacob could only nod. "I'll understand if you walk away," Martha said. "But before you do, I need to tell you the truth, the real story, not the gossip." Under the brilliance of mountain stars, Martha finally spoke words she had buried for decades. She told Jacob how the abuse began after her mother's death, when she was barely 14. How she once fled barefoot into the forest, only to be dragged back and chained for weeks as punishment. How she endured years of captivity, pregnancies, and the anguish of watching her children born with deformities and disabilities that testified to their forbidden conception. Tears streaked her face as she whispered, "I loved them, you know. No matter how they were conceived, no matter their suffering. They were mine. I wanted to protect them, to give them life." Jacob listened, torn between horror and compassion. Finally, he asked the question burning inside him since that hunter found the grave. "And Jeremiah, how did he die?" Martha looked skyward, her silence stretching into the cold night. Then, carefully, she said, "The winter was harsh. He got sick, pneumonia, I think. He wouldn't see the doctor." But as Jacob studied Martha's face in the pale moonlight, he began to wonder if there was more to Jeremiah's death than a simple case of winter illness, and whether Martha's newfound freedom had come at a price that would soon demand its own terrible reckoning. When 7-year-old Sarah asked the question Martha had feared for years, "Why don't I have a father like the other children?" her carefully rebuilt life began to crack. Because how do you explain the unexplainable to a child? And worse, what happens when the ghosts of the past refuse to stay buried, both literally and figuratively? What Martha didn't realize was that the nightmares she had of Jeremiah were about to take on a far more real, far more dangerous form than she could ever imagine. Jacob had long suspected something about Jeremiah's death didn't add up. Martha's hesitation lingered in the air whenever she recounted it. One day, he simply didn't wake up, she would say, her voice carefully measured, but never convincing. Still, after hearing the full scope of her suffering, who was Jacob to press her? On the day he died, Martha continued, a trace of defiance entering her tone, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in decades. I know it sounds awful to say about your own father, but it was as though a shadow had finally lifted, not just from me, but from the girls too. Jacob took her weathered hands in his own, a quiet gesture of compassion. No one should ever endure what you did, he said firmly. At that moment, a small silhouette appeared in the cabin doorway. Sarah stood bathed in lamplight, Jeremiah's piercing blue eyes staring out from her young face. Mommy, she whispered. Martha forced a reassuring smile. It's all right, dear. Mr. Wheeler and I are just talking. Go back to bed. Sarah lingered, studying Jacob with the cautious awareness of a child who already understood that adults carried dangerous secrets. Then she slipped back inside. She looks like him, Martha whispered once Sarah was gone. Sometimes it stops me cold, the way she stares. But then she laughs, and I remember she's not him. She's her own person. She's Sarah. How many other women like Martha lived hidden in rural America, trapped in silence, carrying wounds too heavy to speak aloud? The answer is more unsettling than most are willing to admit. In the months that followed, the Hollister cabin began to change. Jacob visited often, repairing the roof, mending windows, bringing small gifts for the girls, ribbons for Sarah's hair, threads for Ruth's sewing. Slowly, Martha transformed. The woman who once avoided every glance, who flinched at sudden sounds, now stood taller, spoke clearer, and even smiled. But their closeness fueled gossip. In town, whispers spread like wildfire. It isn't right, Abigail Simmons, one of the valley's stern matriarchs, declared. A decent man like Jacob courting her, we all know what she is. Eleanora Davis, older but sharp as ever, snapped back, she's a victim. She didn't choose her life. Those girls are innocent, and she deserves peace. Inside the cabin, however, peace remained fragile. Martha still woke most nights drenched in sweat, haunted by visions of Jeremiah standing at the tree lean or lurking in the shadows of her bedroom. Sometimes I think I see him, she confessed to Jacob, her eyes darting toward the woods. I know it can't be real, but it feels so real. Jacob urged her to seek help. At first she resisted, terrified of judgment. But when the nightmares began to interfere with caring for Sarah and Ruth, she agreed. Dr. Richard Montgomery, a progressive psychiatrist who traveled through mountain towns once a month, became an unlikely lifeline. He saw Martha not as sinful or broken but as a woman scarred by prolonged trauma. Under his guidance, she began the painful process of facing what had happened, step by step, setback by setback, but with a fragile sense of hope she had never known before. Meanwhile, the girls grew. Sarah, sharp and determined, excelled in school despite occasional struggles rooted in her family's genetic curse. Ruth, though limited in independence, discovered joy in needlework, her gentle temperament and creativity a source of light in the household. And then, inevitably, came the questions. One evening, as Martha tucked Sarah into bed, her daughter gazed up with those blue eyes that cut like a knife. Why don't I have a father like the other children? Martha froze, the water glass trembling in her hand. The words she'd rehearsed in her mind for years fled her all at once. How could she tell her child the truth? How could she protect her innocence from a reality that would shatter it forever? Your grandfather Jeremiah, he took care of us after your father left, she said carefully, her voice steady but strained. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Sarah frowned. And where did my father go? Martha swallowed hard. He wasn't ready to be a father. But even as she said it, she felt the hollowness of her answer. But unbeknownst to Martha, her fragile explanation was about to unravel in the most devastating way imaginable. Because Sarah was on the verge of a discovery that would not only shatter her sense of identity, but also prove that some of the Hollister family's darkest secrets were far from buried. At 13 years old, the same age her mother had been when the nightmare began, Sarah climbed into the cabin's dusty attic and uncovered a diary that would destroy everything she thought she knew about her life. Its yellowed pages carried words so shocking that when Martha found her daughter reading them, her first thought wasn't how to console her. It was terror, because she knew history had a way of repeating itself. And Sarah had just reached the age when the Hollister curse traditionally claimed its next victim. Sarah had always been perceptive. Growing up in a house full of half-answers and carefully deflected questions had sharpened her instincts. She rarely pushed too far, but she carried those silences like heavy stones in her heart. Life seemed to turn a corner in 1956, 3 years after Jeremiah's death, when Jacob Wheeler made a quiet but life-altering decision. During a picnic in a sunlit clearing, Jacob took Martha's hands and asked her to marry him. No speeches, no theatrics, just a steady promise. Martha's eyes filled with disbelief. "Are you sure? After everything you know about me, about my past?" Jacob's reply was firm, almost defiant. "I know you, Martha. Not your past. You are a survivor. A mother who sacrificed everything for her daughters. Stronger than anyone I've ever known." Tears welled in Martha's eyes as years of shame battled against this simple, unconditional acceptance. "I don't know if I'll ever be normal," she whispered. "I'm not asking you to be normal," Jacob said softly. "I'm asking you to build a life with me, in our own way, at our own pace." The wedding was small, held inside the cabin with only a few trusted witnesses. For Martha, becoming Mrs. Wheeler meant more than marriage. It was legitimacy, a shield against the judgmental eyes of the community. For Sarah and Ruth, Jacob became the father they'd never had, steady, kind, and untainted by darkness. For a time, life was almost ordinary. But the past has a way of clawing itself back to the surface. And in 1959, it did so with brutal force. Sarah, now 13, spent a rainy afternoon exploring the attic. Under a pile of quilts, she uncovered a wooden box. Inside lay her mother's diary, the one Martha had kept after her own mother died. Sarah opened it. The words on those yellowed pages struck her like lightning. She learned, in raw detail, that Jeremiah was not only her grandfather, but also her father. She read about siblings lost to deformities and disease, the genetic toll of their family's dark legacy. She read about her mother's captivity, the chains, the punishments, the silence. When Martha climbed the attic stairs, she froze at the sight of Sarah sitting motionless, diary open on her lap, tears streaming silently. Martha's stomach twisted with nausea. "Is it true?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. "Grandpa Jeremiah was my father." Martha gripped the doorframe for strength, but she knew there was no escape. "Yes," she whispered, the word dragging itself from her lungs. "It's true." The fragile foundation of the Wheeler-Hollister family collapsed overnight. Sarah withdrew, refusing school, convinced that everyone could see her shame stamped across her face. "I'm a freak," she told her mother. "Half my blood comes from the same man. Is that why Ruth is the way she is? Why did my brothers and sisters die? What's wrong with me that hasn't shown up yet?" Martha, crushed but determined not to lie again, explained the brutal truth of genetics. She told Sarah that some children bore the worst consequences of inbreeding, while others escaped. That Sarah's relative health was, in some ways, a miracle. But Sarah wasn't convinced. "What about my children someday? Will they inherit this curse? Will they be monsters too?" It was Jacob who suggested seeking a geneticist, an idea almost unheard of in the rural 1950s. Through letters, Dr. Benjamin Rosen at the University of Pennsylvania agreed to review their case. For Sarah, the journey to Philadelphia was her first real step beyond the mountains. Dr. Rosen examined her thoroughly, blending scientific clarity with compassion. "You are not a freak," he assured her. "You are a young woman who had the misfortune of being born into tragic circumstances. But that does not define who you are or who you will become." He explained how recessive genes worked, how every person carried them, but they rarely caused problems unless paired with an identical gene from a close family. If you choose a partner with no connection to your bloodline, he told her gently, your children are just as likely to be healthy as anyone else's. The key is ensuring the Hollister curse ends here. But as Dr. Rosen delivered this hopeful news, none of them could have predicted that Sarah's quest for a normal life would lead her down a path that would ultimately bring the Hollister family's darkest secrets full circle, and that her search for love and acceptance would uncover a connection that would make her genetic counseling session seem like a cruel joke. Dr. Rosen's consultation became the turning point that Sarah desperately needed. Though the truth about her origins remained painful, she began to understand a crucial distinction: she wasn't defined by the circumstances of her birth. She was Sarah Wheeler, having officially adopted Jacob's surname, a young woman with her own dreams, aspirations, and unlimited potential. Life in the mountain cabin gradually found a new rhythm of hope and healing. Ruth, now 18, continued developing her remarkable talent for needlework and crafts. Her intricate quilts and tapestries began gaining recognition far beyond their isolated mountain community, bringing beauty into the world despite her personal limitations. In 1962, when Sarah turned 16, fate brought an unexpected gift into her life. Michael Prescott arrived in the region as the son of a university professor studying Appalachian culture and music. What began as friendship blossomed into Sarah's first experience with genuine love. When Sarah finally gathered the courage to reveal her family's dark history, terrified that Michael would abandon her, his response surprised her completely. "My father is Jewish," he said simply. "My grandparents escaped the pogroms in Russia. I know what it's like to carry the weight of family history, Sarah. I understand what it means to be judged not for who you are, but for what others think you represent." Their romance flourished despite the whispered disapproval of some community members. When Sarah received a scholarship to study nursing at West Virginia University, an extraordinary achievement for a young woman from her background, Michael supported her decision without hesitation. Martha watched her daughter's transformation with profound amazement. Sarah was creating a life that Martha herself had never dared to imagine: higher education, a professional career, and the freedom to choose her own destiny. In 1965, during Sarah's final year of nursing school, she and Michael married in the university chapel. Martha, wearing a carefully chosen light blue dress, had never felt more radiant than when she watched her daughter walk down the aisle toward a future filled with possibilities. That same year, Dr. Montgomery approached Martha with an unexpected request. The field of psychology was beginning to recognize the widespread nature of child abuse and incest, topics previously shrouded in complete silence. "Your story, told anonymously, could help professionals better understand how to identify and assist victims," he explained. "More importantly, it might help other women and girls in similar situations realize they're not alone." After months of careful consideration and discussions with Jacob and her daughters, Martha agreed to participate in an academic study on survivors of prolonged family trauma. Her case, published under the pseudonym Patient H, became one of the most referenced examples in emerging literature on trauma and resilience. Tragedy struck in 1970 when Ruth passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 29. Heart complications, likely related to her genetic heritage, led to silent heart failure. She died surrounded by her beautiful creations, quilts, tapestries, and embroideries that told stories in fabric when words had failed her. Sarah returned for the funeral with Michael and their two healthy children, 5-year-old Elizabeth and 3-year-old James. It was the children's first visit to the mountain cabin where their mother had grown up. Martha, now 53, watched her grandchildren playing in the same sunny clearing where she had once played as a child, where Sarah had taken her first steps, where Ruth had sat sewing in peaceful moments. She saw both continuity and necessary separation from the past. "They'll never know, will they?" Martha asked Sarah as they observed the children at play. "About Jeremiah, about everything that happened?" Sarah looked at her mother with eyes that carried both wisdom and compassion, those same blue eyes that had once belonged to Jeremiah, now transformed by love and understanding. "One day, when they're older, I'll tell them an appropriate version," she replied thoughtfully. "Not all the details, but enough for them to understand where we came from and what we overcame. I want them to know about their grandmother's incredible strength, how you broke a cycle that could have continued for generations." Tears filled Martha's eyes. "Do you really think it's possible? Actually breaking the cycle after so many generations of darkness?" Sarah smiled, an expression that carried equal measures of knowledge and hope. Look at them, Mom. Look at me, at Michael, at you and Jacob. We've already broken it. As the sun set behind the ancient Appalachian peaks, bathing the clearing in golden light, Martha Hollister Wheeler finally allowed herself to believe that perhaps the sins of previous generations need not be visited upon their children. With love, courage, and truth, even the darkest family stories could give way to new beginnings. Years passed quietly. The mountains remained silent witnesses to generations of both pain and healing. After Martha and Jacob's deaths in 1985, the old cabin was eventually abandoned, slowly returning to the earth from which it came. The small family cemetery became a peaceful resting place, visited occasionally by Sarah and later by her children and grandchildren. The story of the Hollister Wheeler family lives on primarily in academic archives, in studies of family trauma and human resilience, and in carefully chosen stories passed down through Sarah's descendants. What was once a devastating cycle of abuse and tragedy had transformed into a powerful narrative of survival and hope. The mountains keep their secrets well, and for decades it seemed that the Hollister family's darkest chapter had finally been laid to rest alongside those buried in that quiet hillside cemetery. But in 2023, nearly 40 years after Martha's death, a young graduate student named David Morrison was researching historical cases of family trauma for his doctoral dissertation at a prestigious East Coast university. Deep in the archives, he discovered the case file of Patient H, Martha's story, preserved in clinical detail. As David read through the documents, comparing them with genealogical records and historical data, he made a discovery that would have terrified Martha if she had lived to see it. Asterisk because David Morrison wasn't just any researcher. His great-grandfather's name was Ezekiel Morrison, and Ezekiel Morrison had been Jeremiah Hollister's cousin, part of the same isolated mountain family that had practiced intermarriage for generations. The very bloodline that Dr. Rosen had warned Sarah to avoid was now actively seeking to uncover and reconnect with the Hollister family legacy. And David had just discovered exactly where Sarah's children and grandchildren lived, asterisk. The cycle that Martha thought she had broken forever was about to come full circle in the most terrifying way imaginable. The story of the Hollister Wheeler family now lives. Mainly in academic memory, in the archives of studies on family abuse and human resilience, and in the stories passed down through generations of Sarah's family. What was once a cycle of abuse and trauma became a narrative of overcoming and hope. After decades of pain and healing, Martha finally believed that her family's dark curse had been broken forever. Her daughter Sarah had found love, built a career, and raised healthy children far from the shadow of the mountain cabin. But what Martha didn't know was that hidden in the archives of a university library, a young researcher had just discovered her case file under Patient H, and this researcher's last name was one that would make Martha's blood run cold if she knew. Because sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes, it comes looking for you when you least expect it.